Listen, I I know your paper is on Nietzsche and Buddhism, but I know from you personally that Nietzsche is someone that you are super passionate about. You're obsessed with. You've been obsessed with for a decent amount of time. Um, and before we get into like the specifics of his ideas, one of the things that I think is really important to do uh, in all subject matters, but particularly philosophy and one that becomes very complex, is how do you explain it to somebody that hasn't read a lot of the things that you've read, hasn't studied it for the length that you know, isn't familiar with the same terms that those of us who have gone through a philosophy degree are. Um, so to make this episode more accessible to the everyday person, and that's not a derogatory term, that's just somebody who hasn't studied philosophy, can you explain to me in the most broad terms possible who Nietzsche was, what was his main ideas, and why the hell are you so damn obsessed with him?
So Nietzsche's a very interesting character. I mean, also for the impact he's left. I mean, the way he's treated now, he's an incredibly famous philosopher, probably one of the most famous ones, besides the ancient Greeks and a few other names. And well, it's also interesting because although he's very famous, both I think academically and outside, in academia he's always very frequently referenced. But in both cases, I think there's few people who actually go in depth in Nietzsche ideas. He's always brought up in the conversation, and he's always sort of acknowledged as an important person, but rarely is he ever the central focus. So I think it's important to dig in deep. And I mean, the main thing he's known for is for being very radical. He represents a break from the dominant Western tradition in lots of ways. In the 18th century, obviously, the main thing is, I think, the Enlightenment. Right? There's a general post-Kantian, with the Enlightenment, a focus on reason, and what Nietzsche calls the death of God, which is probably his most famous saying. What he's referring to there is the loss in belief in God in society, which he sort of saw a lot sooner than a lot of other people. And the main thing that preoccupied him was how are we going to replace this loss of God? And the Enlightenment project generally sees reason as filling in the role that God used to play. Reason can ground morality, sort of as long as we continue in focusing on reason and empirical evidence, sort of we will figure out the best way to live. And this was what religion previously did. Nietzsche pushes back against this very heavily. Um, and he sees the reason as just being incapable of fulfilling that role in principle. And that's a big that's a very big statement, especially for a philosophy student like I was. um, I mean, the reason one gets into philosophy a lot is based on this kind of idea, maybe subconsciously, that if we think hard enough and just do philosophy and study, eventually we'll be able to figure out what to do with our lives, the true nature of reality, and align ourselves with this. That's generally the trend in most of Western philosophy, the project you'd say that most of philosophers are trying to do. And yeah, for me, reading Nietzsche was a sort of very big personal shock of like, wow, um, it sort of exposes first of all what I didn't even know that I thought of things in that way, and it gave me a whole new perspective on how one might approach philosophy.
So I want to come back to this idea in a little bit, but I just want to first summarize briefly what you said, and you can tell me if this is correct or not. The idea is that God is dead, and so people need some way to orient their lives or justify their actions without God. And he thinks that, contrary to most of the Enlightenment tradition, reason is incapable of doing that.
Yes, yes, yes. Well, we have a idea in philosophy at the time that we're unbiased thinkers. That in doing philosophy, we're sort of setting our own personal biases aside and getting closer to the objective truth. And morality is included in that. Obviously, the ethics, this whole study of ethics, is supposed to be that. Um, But Nietzsche pushes heavily against this. For him, probably one of his biggest insights, and I think one of the ones that personally, I guess, hit me the most, is that all of the philosophy you do, no matter how it might seem like you're a sort of a clean surgeon who has cleaned his hands and is carefully dissecting uh, the body, you know, your hands are always going to be dirty. Whatever philosophy you have, and this is especially true in the domain of ethics, but Nietzsche extends this to any metaphysics and all of philosophy. You know, it's ultimately a reflection of your own character. You know, Nietzsche calls it a personal confession. Every philosophy hitherto has been a personal confession to one's own psychological state. And yeah, so Nietzsche's goal when he sort of analyzes other philosophers, which is really interesting, is he doesn't actually look at the philosophy. He looks at the philosophy behind the philosophy. So he says, you know, there's always a philosophy underwriting the philosophy you put out. And Nietzsche is very influential in this point because it's sort of a precursor to psychoanalysis, basically, you know, that your verbal reports, what you say you believe in, what you say you want, aren't really, truly what you actually want. You know, there are the hidden desires that are always under work, hidden drives in Nietzsche's terminology. And that for
So
me was a very personal sort of revelation. It sort of actually had to make me stop and think, you know, like, why is it that I philosophize? You know, what do I want from philosophy? What is the things that are being expressed by the philosophical views that I have?
so one of the things I think that can be helpful to do, and I think really fits with this theme, is putting a character to the ideas. So could you just talk about like Nietzsche's life, like literally his life, the things that he went through, and how that shaped this idea that you're talking about now?
So I'd say the main thing that characterizes Nietzsche in his life is he had a life of extreme suffering. It's almost impossible to separate his life from this, for his philosophy from this, in fact. And he doesn't try to, you know, unlike the way he criticizes other thinkers who is, you know, they try to abstract their philosophy from themselves to reach an objective truth. Nietzsche wholeheartedly accepts that, no, my philosophy is a reflection of who I am. And it's almost a source of pride for this. And so, yeah, Nietzsche's was born in a religious family but lost his faith after a while. His father, who was a pastor, died at a very young age, and throughout his whole life, he was sick, very sick. He had bouts of migraines which would last like weeks on end, with temporary blindness and vomiting all the time. He was incapable of doing anything, and sort of, I think the loss of faith definitely impacted him a lot because obviously there was no meaning to all this suffering. He's struggling to find any meaning in this, and sort of the secular moralities that took the place of Christianity, for instance, like utilitarianism under a strict utilitarian calculus, we would judge that Nietzsche's life was terrible because it had far more suffering than it did pleasure. But Nietzsche wants to reject that. Obviously, he sees like, who are you to tell me that my life isn't worth living? His philosophical project is essentially finding a reason to affirm life in and of itself. You know, he wants to make all the suffering worth it in a sense, and that's why Nietzsche is. You connect to his philosophy on a much more personal level. I think it's Badiou who said this when he was asked about Nietzsche. He said that even though you may disagree with Nietzsche, you can't really see Nietzsche as sort of a philosopher like you do in most other thinkers. You know, Nietzsche is more of like a friend almost. He says, you know, when you're reading Nietzsche's work, I always feel you feel a personal connection to him. You know, because the project that he's embarking on is one that's, you know, deeply personal and relatable, and I think it's worth reading his books with always that in mind.
So it's something like Nietzsche. Nietzsche had a life of immense suffering, immense pain, and he's looking at all these other philosophers who are saying, well, there's something better outside of that pain, outside of that suffering that can justify your life. And he's sitting there going, my life has been nothing but suffering, and I'm not looking to justify my life or appreciate life by changing that suffering. I'm looking at my life and trying to appreciate in tandem with the suffering.
Yes, yes,
Is
yes.
that
The suffering in of itself, like life in of itself. I mean, his main criticism of Christianity, which is part of what my paper gets to, is the whole notion of salvation. He thinks it puts up, that we need to be saved from our current lives. That our current lives, Christianity implicitly gives a negative value judgment to life because it says that life is only worth something insofar as it leads to the kingdom of God. And Nietzsche wants to push back against this a lot. You see this as a nihilistic point of view, which is strange considering obviously nihilism is usually seen as the opposite of Christianity. But Nietzsche calls Christianity itself nihilistic because of its devaluation of life. And so, Nietzsche's project is to be able to value life in and of itself intrinsically.